Welcome to the Wealth Wisdom, where money has history and knowledge becomes power.
Most people believe economic growth is a simple formula: more business, more jobs, more money, more prosperity. But what if I told you that the very system we depend on, the global economy itself, only grows for one disturbing reason, and that reason is debt? What if every boom, every rise in living standards, every technological leap, every government promise, and every decade of expansion was quietly powered by a mathematical trap? A trap so deep that even world leaders, central bankers, and financial experts pretend it isn't there. Because here's the mystery: if debt is so dangerous, why do the most developed nations in the world have the highest debt levels? Why do governments keep borrowing more, even when they promise to reduce deficits? Why does the financial system crash every time debt stops expanding? And most importantly, why does the entire global economy collapse if debt slows down? Not even stops, just slows. You're about to discover a truth that almost no school teaches, no politician admits, and no mainstream economist wants to say publicly. Economic growth is impossible without expanding debt forever. But this isn't just a story about money. It is a story about a system built on promises that can never be kept, and what happens when the bill finally comes due. To understand how we got here, we need to go back, not to the financial crisis of 2008, not to the rise of central banks, but all the way to the origins of money itself. Because the moment humans created money, they accidentally created debt. And the moment debt was created, a countdown began, a countdown toward a system that must constantly inflate, constantly expand, and constantly borrow, or die. Picture ancient Mesopotamia, thousands of years ago. People traded grain, livestock, tools, labor. But barter was messy. What if you had goats, but needed wheat, and the wheat farmer didn't want goats? So societies invented units of value, early currencies, to simplify trade. Temples and palace authorities recorded transactions, tracked who owed what, and invented something that changed human history forever: the ledger, a written record that allowed people to buy today with the promise of paying tomorrow. That simple idea, pay later, is the seed from which the entire global economy grew. But here's the twist most people never learn: the moment money became a claim on the future, economies needed growth to justify those claims. If people borrowed grain in the spring, the harvest had to be bigger in the fall. If a kingdom borrowed gold to build roads, the roads had to increase trade enough to repay the loan. Growth wasn't a luxury, it was a requirement. As civilizations expanded, so did their ambitions. Armies needed funding, trade networks needed ships, emperors needed monuments, and almost every major civilization discovered the same method to fuel expansion: borrow more. Fast forward to medieval Europe. Banks emerged, lending to monarchs who financed wars they couldn't afford. If they won, the economy grew. If they lost, the bankers lost their heads, literally. But the real turning point, the moment when expanding debt became not just normal, but necessary, arrived with the birth of modern capitalism. Industrialization changed everything. Machines increased output. Factories multiplied goods. Transportation networks linked cities and nations. Productivity exploded. But building machines, factories, and railroads required massive upfront investments, and the returns took years. Debt wasn't just helpful anymore. It became the engine of progress. Whenever investors lent money to entrepreneurs, the money ended up in workers' hands as wages. Workers spent those wages on goods. Businesses earned profits. And those profits justified the original loan. This cycle of borrowing gives, spending gives, earning gives, repayment gives more. Borrowing became the beating heart of the modern economy. But hidden inside this new system was a flaw, an invisible ticking mechanism. Every loan creates money, but to repay a loan, you need more money than was borrowed, because loans come with interest. That means the total amount of debt must always be larger tomorrow than it is today. For the system to function, money supply must grow, spending must grow, production must grow, and debt must grow and sink. If debt stops growing, the system starts to suffocate. This wasn't a problem at first, because the world was still young, still expanding, still building. But, as the decades turned into centuries, an uncomfortable reality appeared. Economies were becoming addicted to debt expansion. Take the 20th century. After World War II, governments wanted prosperity, stability, and full employment, but growth wasn't guaranteed. So, economists turned to a new formula: stimulate demand with credit. Allow ordinary people to borrow for homes, cars, education. Let businesses borrow to expand. Allow governments to borrow to fund highways, public services, and social programs. Debt became the foundation of economic policy. But something else happened to something subtle, something dangerous. Each economic boom required more debt than the one before. It didn't matter which country, which industry, or which era. The pattern was universal. Debt rises, growth follows. Debt slows. Recession begins. This pattern became so predictable that the U.S. Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and most major governments started designing policies around it. Their goal was simple: ensure credit keeps flowing. Because if credit slows, spending slows, business slows, tax revenue slows, and suddenly the entire structure starts to crack. We saw this clearly in the 1970s. Inflation skyrocketed, growth stagnated, and the US dollar backed by gold started showing stress. The gold standard imposed a limit on money creation. And a limit on money creation means a limit on debt. President Nixon made a decision that changed the world. He removed the dollar from gold. The dollar became purely symbolic, backed only by confidence. And that meant banks could lend far more money. Governments could borrow without restraint. And debt could expand forever. Or so it seemed. The next 4 decades were an experiment in limitless financial engineering. Interest rates were lowered repeatedly to encourage more borrowing. Financial markets were deregulated. Credit cards exploded in popularity. Student loans became a $1 trillion industry. Corporations borrowed to buy back their own stock. Governments borrowed to fund everything from social programs to wars. The global economy was thriving, but only because debt was exploding. Then came the 2008 financial crisis. For the first time in modern history, debt growth reversed. Housing markets collapsed. Banks froze lending. Credit contracted. And within months, the world economy spiraled into the deepest recession since the Great Depression. Why? Because the system had hit the breaking point. Too much debt, not enough income to service it, and not enough borrowers to keep the cycle alive. So central banks intervened with a new idea: quantitative easing. They printed trillions of dollars, bought bonds, lowered interest rates to zero, and in some countries even below zero. Their goal wasn't just to save banks. It was to force debt expansion at all costs. Their strategy worked temporarily. The markets recovered. Asset prices soared. But the underlying issue, the one nobody wanted to face, remained untouched. Growth requires ever-increasing debt, and debt requires ever-increasing growth. The cycle had become a snake eating its own tail. Fast forward to today. Global debt has reached more than $315 trillion, far higher than the size of the entire world economy. Governments owe more than they can possibly repay. Corporations depend on refinancing old loans to survive. Consumers rely on credit to maintain their lifestyles. And central banks stand ready to inject liquidity whenever debt expansion slows. But here's the twist that almost nobody sees coming. The system no longer simply wants growth, it requires exponential growth. It needs debt to rise faster and faster each decade just to avoid collapse. Every recession, every crisis, every market shock in the last 50 years shares a secret common cause. Debt expansion slowed down. Not stopped, just slowed. We saw this in 1998 with the Asian financial crisis. In 2000 with the dot-com crash. In 2008 with the mortgage crisis. In 2020 with the pandemic shock. Each time, the symptoms looked different. But the cause was identical: The credit machine hiccuped. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What happens when the machine stops for good? What happens when people can't borrow more? When governments hit their limits? When central banks can't push rates lower? And when more debt simply becomes impossible? Economists rarely discuss this, but the math is simple. If debt can't grow, the money supply shrinks. If the money supply shrinks, spending decreases. If spending decreases, businesses lose revenue. If businesses lose revenue, they lay off workers. Laid off workers stop spending even more, and the cycle accelerates downward. Without expanding debt, the system collapses into a deflationary spiral. Governments know this. Central banks know this. Financial institutions know this, and that's why every solution to every crisis always involves the same thing. More debt. Lower interest rates. Stimulus checks. Government borrowing. Corporate bailouts. Quantitative easing. Credit guarantees. Liquidity injections. Bond purchases. Refinancing programs. Every fix is the same fix. And every fix makes the long-term problem worse. Like giving a dehydrated man seawater. The more he drinks, the more he needs. Now, here's the part that directly affects your life, your job, your savings, your retirement, your cost of living. As debt expands exponentially, two things happen. First, asset prices rise. Homes, stocks, commodities, not because of real economic strength, but because money is being pumped into the system. This makes the rich richer and locks everyone else out. Second, inflation becomes permanent. Governments can't admit this, but once debt reaches a certain level, inflation becomes the only way to reduce its real value. It's a quiet tax, a hidden method to make debt seem manageable while you pay more for everything. Every time governments spend, they're not spending revenue, they're spending debt. And every dollar they borrow requires the system to grow faster tomorrow. But tomorrow arrives, and then the next, and then the next. At some point, the system becomes so leveraged that policymakers face a dangerous choice: let debt collapse and risk global chaos, or keep expanding it and hope nobody notices the inevitability. So far, they've always chosen expansion. This brings us to the repeating pattern, something historians will one day identify as the central flaw of the 21st century economy: the belief that infinite growth is possible on a finite planet using a financial system that requires exponential borrowing. We are now living inside the late stages of a system designed for a world that no longer exists, a world with endless land, endless population growth, endless resources, endless opportunity. But today, demographics are slowing. Energy costs are rising, resource limits are appearing, and global economies are hitting maturity. Yet the debt curve still demands exponential growth. This is why you hear constant talk about productivity boosts, innovation, AI-driven efficiency, global trade expansion, and new markets. These aren't hopeful ideas, they're survival strategies. They're attempts to keep an aging system alive just a little bit longer, but deep down, the structure hasn't changed. For every year of economic expansion, the amount of new debt required grows dramatically. It now takes far more borrowing to generate the same amount of GDP growth. The returns on debt are collapsing. We're running up the down escalator, and the escalator is speeding up. As we move into the future, the pressure to keep debt expanding will grow stronger. Governments will borrow more. Central banks will intervene more frequently. Digital currencies may emerge not as innovations, but as control mechanisms to ensure credit flows where policymakers want it. Asset bubbles will appear more often. Crises will become more frequent. And the gap between financial reality and political messaging will widen. Eventually, the system will face a choice: reorganize itself or break. The question is not if, but when. And when that moment comes, the world will have to confront a truth it has avoided for centuries: debt-based growth is not infinite. It is temporary, it is a phase, and humanity will either transition to a system that does not require constant expansion, or experience a collapse that forces the transition. So, what does this mean for you? First, understand that crises are not accidents. They are structural. They are built into the system. Each crisis marks the moment when debt expansion slows. When you recognize this pattern, you can see financial shocks before they happen. Second, understand that inflation is not a mistake. It is a feature. It is a built-in mechanism to reduce the real burden of debt. The more debt the system carries, the more inflation you will experience in your daily life. Third, understand that governments will not save the system without consequences. Every bailout, every rescue plan, every monetary intervention kicks the can further down the road and magnifies the scale of the next crisis. Which brings us to the final warning. If economic growth requires expanding debt forever, and if debt can't expand forever, then at some point, the system must change, either through intentional redesign or through collapse. The open question, the one left for future generations, is this: will we choose the transition, or will it choose us? If you want to understand how this system works, how to protect yourself, and how the next decade will reshape the world economy, make sure to subscribe, because upcoming videos will break down these forces in detail and help you see what most people never notice until it's too late. Thanks for watching. Stay aware, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next video.